My name is Emily Rose, and if you'd told me back then, at 6 years old, that silence would be the loudest sound of my childhood, I wouldn't have understood what they were talking about. But I understood later, when Dad left. We lived in a small house in the suburbs of San Jose, California. The house was ordinary, a creaky staircase, faded carpet, a constantly dripping faucet in the kitchen. But while Dad was with us, it felt secure, like a fortress. Dad's name was Daniel. He worked as an engineer at a small company. He was often late, but always came home with a smile. Sometimes he'd bring me ice cream, sometimes he'd just sit next to me on the couch and ask how my day was. Mom's name was Caroline. It was she who destroyed that fortress. At first, I didn't understand what was happening. I just heard screaming. Almost every night. You brought less than you promised again. I work as much as I can, Caroline. That's not enough. You're a nobody, Daniel. A complete zero. I lay in bed, pressing my pillow over my ears. It wasn't the screams that scared me, but the silences between them. There was something cold, final, about those silences. One day, Dad came home from work unusually happy. I remember it clearly. He was even whistling. I got a promotion, he said, walking into the kitchen. Not a big one, but a steady one. It's a step up. I saw the way he looked at Mom, as if he was waiting for permission to be happy. Mom didn't even look up from the phone. Is that all? She said in an even, almost bored voice. I thought you'd finally find a real job. I saw his shoulders slump, as if someone had turned off a light inside him. A month later, he left. Mom told everyone he'd abandoned us, that he'd run away, that he'd left her alone with a child and debts. I knew it wasn't true. Dad called. He sent money. He wrote letters. But Mom was angry every time the money transfers arrived. Look at this, Emily, she said, waving the receipt. He thinks he can buy his daughter off with this. I didn't know how much was enough. I only knew one thing. If Mom was angry, it meant she was going to have a bad day. At work, Mom quickly realized what role she could play. Abandoned single mother became her signature move. I'm sorry, Mr. Blake, she sobbed. My daughter wasn't feeling well. I couldn't leave her alone. Meanwhile, I was sitting at home, watching cartoons and eating cereal from the box. Family holidays were the worst. Mom loved being the center of attention. He left, she told her relatives. He just packed his things and disappeared. I sat next to him and said nothing. I already knew. If I told the truth, there would be retribution at home. When I turned 9, I noticed my mother looking at me differently. Long intently. Later, I realized I was too much like my father. But then I just felt like I'd become inconvenient. When I turned 11, Mom met Brian. He was older, successful, and worked in real estate. And at that moment, I ceased to be part of her image. At first, it was little things. My uniform wouldn't be washed for weeks. You're a big girl now, Mom would say. You'll figure it out yourself. Food was disappearing. I miscalculated, she would shrug. Make yourself something. She started accidentally throwing away my school projects. My grades were slipping. The teachers looked at me with pity. Brian didn't notice. To him, Mom was caring, gentle, perfect. When Mom got pregnant, I became a maid. I can't stress myself, she would say, lying on the couch. Clean, cook, bring. I was invisible. Until that night, when I dialed Dad's number. Dad. I whispered. Pick me up. He arrived at dawn. Mom smiled when I left. Too happily. And that's when I realized I was never her daughter. I was a tool. My father's apartment was in an old house near downtown Auckland. Nothing luxurious. 2 rooms, a narrow hallway, a kitchen with peeling paint. But when I stepped through the door with my backpack over my shoulder, I suddenly felt better. For the first time in years. My father didn't question me right away. He simply put on the kettle, sliced apples, and sat down across from me, as if we had all the time in the world. There was no pity in his gaze, only attentiveness, the very one I sorely lacked. For the first few weeks, I was constantly expecting a catch. I'd wake up in the middle of the night from the silence, certain a scream was about to erupt. But there was no screaming. There were morning breakfasts, conversations on the way to school, and simple phrases like, "Are you okay?" and "If anything happens, let me know." I quickly realized that my dad lived modestly not because he couldn't afford it anymore, but because he'd spent years simply trying to survive the divorce. He worked as a consultant, took on projects one after another, sometimes returning late, but always finding time to check my homework or ask what was new. A couple of months later, he cautiously told me he'd applied to transfer me to another school. A private one. Small but with a good reputation. I was scared. Such schools seemed unattainable to me. But my father just smiled and said that opportunities exist for those who are ready to accept them. The school turned out to be difficult. The kids there were confident, well-groomed, many from well-off families. I felt like an outsider, especially at first. But unlike before, now I knew that if things got too hard, at home they wouldn't blame me, but would support me. Gradually, I began to straighten up, literally and figuratively. I stopped slouching, stopped apologizing for my existence. My grades went up. Teachers stopped looking at me with concern. They now looked at me with respect. Around this time, my father's business started to improve. At first, it was small victories, a new client, a renewed contract. Then the projects became more serious. I saw him change, how confidence appeared in his movements, how he began to make plans again. 2 years later, we moved. The new house was in a quieter neighborhood, with lots of greenery and wide streets. I got my own room, a real one, with a door I could close not out of fear, but for privacy. I started cooking. At first because I wanted to help my father. Then because I enjoyed it. The kitchen became my refuge. The smells, the order, the sense of control. All of this gave me a sense of security. I was learning to care, not out of fear, but out of love. When I turned 16, my father gave me a car. Used, but well-maintained. I didn't immediately believe it was mine. I remember sitting behind the wheel and crying, not even from joy, but from the realization that someone trusted me. We hardly talked about my mother. It was an unspoken agreement. She never called. Not on my birthday, not at Christmas. And with each passing year, the pain dulled, turning into a dull, distant memory. By my senior year, my father's business had grown so much that he began to think about expanding. He worked hard, but he no longer seemed broken. The same firmness I remembered from childhood reappeared in his voice. I entered a university in another state. When we said goodbye, my father hugged me tightly and told me he was proud of me. I realized that moment was worth all the years I had lived through. I left without running away. I was moving forward. And it was precisely then, in this new stage of my life, that I didn't yet know that the past can wait. Patiently. For years. Only to one day remind me of itself in the cruelest possible way. By the time I turned 27, my life seemed stable. I was living in Chicago, working in the analytics department of a large consulting firm and gradually taking on more and more responsibility in my father's business, while formally remaining in the shadows. He always said he'd have time to officially hand over control to me when the time was right. We joked that he loved working too much to truly retire. That day, he called me in the middle of a work meeting. I immediately sensed something was wrong. His voice was calm, too calm. He said the doctors had found a problem and asked me to fly out for the weekend. I canceled everything and got on the first flight. The diagnosis sounded like a death sentence. An aggressive form of cancer. Late stage. Treatment is possible, but there are no guarantees. The doctor's office smelled of antiseptic and hopelessness. I sat, clasping my hands and nodding, pretending to understand every word, though inside everything was screaming. From that moment on, my life narrowed to one goal: keeping him as long as possible. I took a long leave of absence, moved back to my father's house, and began living by a schedule of procedures, medications, and tests. I studied medical articles at night, arranged consultations, researched clinics, and believed in miracles, because without this belief, it was impossible to wake up in the morning. Sometimes we had good days. We sat in the garden, drank tea, and talked about trivial matters. He told stories from my school days and laughed, as if the illness had retreated, if only for a few hours. In those moments, I felt like everything could still be fixed. But there were more bad days. One such evening, he asked me to sit next to him. His hand was cold and light, as if it didn't belong to him. He looked at me for a long time, intently, as if trying to remember. He asked me to go on living. Really? Not to let his death become an anchor. I nodded and promised, though deep down I already knew this promise would be the hardest of my life. 2 weeks later, he was gone. I held his hand and felt not only a person but the very foundation of my world leaving the room. After the funeral, I moved as if in a fog. Documents, calls, people, words of sympathy, everything blended into one endless echo. I barely slept, barely ate, existing on autopilot. And just then the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. I wanted to hang up, but answered automatically. I recognized the voice immediately, despite the passing years. It had become softer, quieter, but it was her. She said she was sorry, that she'd heard about Daniel's death, that she wanted to help. The word help cut right through my ears, but I was too exhausted to cut it off right away. We met at the funeral home. She wasn't alone. She was with a teenager, about 14 years old. My half-brother. She adjusted his collar, touched his shoulder, and spoke tenderly. I watched it as if it were a scene from someone else's life. She really did help. She organized, made arrangements, took over conversations I didn't have the strength to have. People looked at us and saw a grieving mother and daughter. No one knew the truth. After the funeral, she didn't disappear. She called. She asked how I was coping. She said, "Darling, my girl." I was wary, but loneliness was taking its toll. When you lose the only person who is your support, any illusion of closeness seems like salvation. Over time, the conversations began to change. At first, cautiously, casually. Questions about my father's business, about real estate, about how difficult it all was for me. I answered evasively. Something inside me kept me from opening up fully. Then came the hints. Money for tutors. My husband's problems. Loans. Hard times. Every conversation left an unpleasant aftertaste, as if I was being slowly led to something. I started helping. A little. Here and there. Convincing myself that this was normal. That maybe she had changed. That maybe we still had a chance for some semblance of a family. I was wrong. The climax came when she called me during the workday. She spoke confidently, almost demandingly. We were talking about large sums of money, about the future, about how I had to. At that moment, something clicked inside me. All the memories, all the humiliations, all the loneliness came flooding back at once. I said, "No." Her voice changed instantly. The mask fell. What remained was anger, contempt, and cold fury. She spoke words that completely destroyed the last of her illusions. After that conversation, I sat in silence for a long time. I knew it wasn't over. People like her don't give up easily. And I was right. The business trip to Seattle was supposed to be a respite. Contracts, meetings, negotiations. Everything was going according to plan, but a strange unease nagged at me inside. After that conversation with my mother, I tried not to think about her, but the feeling of someone quietly moving furniture behind me didn't go away. A month later, I returned to Chicago late in the evening. The house greeted me with a silence that felt wrong. The hallway smelled of someone else's perfume. I put down my suitcase and froze, listening. Then I opened the door to the living room, and reality shattered. Strange people were sitting on my couch. A man and a woman, confused, holding cups of tea. All around them were things that weren't mine. Not my paintings. Not my house. I asked who they were, almost in a whisper, because my voice was failing me. They answered calmly, even sympathetically. They said they had bought the apartment legally. The papers were signed. The deal was done. The saleswoman was a woman named Caroline Rose. I felt a chill, as if my spine had been ripped out. I walked outside, not remembering how. My first thought was, the police. But before I dialed, I called her. I needed to hear it from her. She didn't deny it. She didn't even try. There was satisfaction in her voice. She said it was my own fault, that I should have shared. That family is an obligation. That now everything is fair. I went to see them. I didn't think, I acted. Her husband opened the door. He looked tired, aged. I told him everything. The words tumbled out one after another, as if they'd been waiting for this moment for years. When he realized what had happened, he sat down. He simply sat on the steps and was silent for a long time. Then he pulled out the documents. Bank statements. Credit agreements. Bills. The picture was terrifying. She had been lying to everyone. Living in debt. She spent money that didn't exist. She forged signatures. I called the police right from their home. The investigation lasted months. It turned out the sale of the apartment was just the tip of the iceberg. Forged documents, loans in other people's names, hidden accounts. When she was arrested, she looked at me for the first time without looking down. There was fear in her eyes. The trial was public. The press loved stories like this. The perfect mother turned out to be a fraud. I sat in the courtroom, listening to the charges, and felt a strange calm. This wasn't revenge. It was the re-establishment of boundaries. The sentence was harsh. A prison sentence. An order to repay the money. Her husband filed for divorce and was awarded custody of their son. He called me later and thanked me. He said I had saved more than just myself. The money for the apartment was returned. I didn't buy another one. I bought a small house outside the city. A garden. Peace. Space. I returned to managing my father's business full-time. Every day, sitting in his office, I felt his presence, not as pain, but as support. I lived, just as I promised. Sometimes the past comes back to haunt me, but it no longer controls me. This story isn't about revenge. It's about how even if you were broken as a child, it doesn't mean you have to stay broken. Sometimes justice comes quietly, but it does come.